My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 70 years old today. For 40 of those years, more than half of my life, my world did not spin on its own axis. It revolved, with the relentless demanding gravity of a captured moon, around my son, David. My life was a garden I tended for a single, magnificent, and voraciously hungry bloom. Every other plant, every potential shoot of my own ambition was pruned back, its nutrients diverted to him. I did it willingly. I called it love. Now, I have other names for it. Before David, there was another Eleanor, a younger woman who smelled of damp earth and chlorophyll, whose fingers were perpetually stained with soil and ink. My dream was a quiet, scholarly one. I was a botanist, specializing in the delicate, almost forgotten language of bryophytes, mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. My small apartment was a humid sanctuary of terracotta pots and glass terrariums. I dreamed of trekking through the misty forests of the Pacific Northwest, of discovering a new species and giving it a name, a small whisper of my existence that would outlive me. I had a grant application, nearly complete, for a research position at the University of Edinburgh, a place of stone and history and rain-soaked gardens. The acceptance letter for my PhD program was framed, not on a wall, but in my heart. It was the blueprint for a life I was meant to live. Then came the storm that was David's father, a whirlwind romance that left me breathless, and eventually alone with a positive pregnancy test and a heart full of promises he never intended to keep. The moment I held David, a tiny, screaming, fiercely alive thing in my arms, the blueprint in my heart was torn to shreds. The smell of damp earth was replaced by the cloying sweetness of baby powder and sour milk. My research books were pushed aside for parenting manuals. The grant application was tucked into a box, then another box, and finally lost to the geology of forgotten things in the attic. My dream of Edinburgh became a faded postcard, a ghost of a life unlived. I told myself it was a trade, not a sacrifice. I traded the silent companionship of mosses for the chaotic symphony of a child's laughter. I traded the cool, hallowed halls of a university library for the sticky, crayon-strewn floors of a suburban home. I took a job as a receptionist at a local dental clinic. The work was sterile, predictable, and paid the bills. It was a world of bleached white, the scent of antiseptic, and the ceaseless, polite drone of the phone. No part of it nourished my soul, but it nourished David. And in the beginning, that was enough. Every penny I saved, every extra shift I took, was a brick in the foundation of his future. I remember the year he wanted soccer camp. The fees and the new equipment cost as much as my entire grocery budget for 2 weeks. I ate potato soup for 14 days straight. I'd sit on the sidelines, my stomach rumbling softly, watching him score a goal. His joy was my feast. When he needed a car to get to his first part-time job, an impossible dream for a receptionist's son, I didn't laugh. I took a second job cleaning offices at night for a full year. The smell of industrial bleach and quiet desperation clung to my clothes, a coarse perfume of maternal devotion. David, in his shiny used sedan, never knew. He just knew the thrill of the ride. My sacrifices were invisible by design. They were the load-bearing walls of his childhood, the hidden plumbing that brought comfort and ease. I was the silent engine, humming in the background of his life. I darned his socks, typed his school papers late into the night when my own eyes were burning with fatigue, and stayed up listening to the slow tick of the clock until his key turned in the lock, long after his curfew. I absorbed his teenage tempests, his broken hearts, his academic anxieties, my own emotions a forgotten, secondary consideration. My body became a repository for unspoken worry, a landscape etched with the fine lines of his crises. I thought he saw. I believed that somewhere, beneath the self-absorption of youth, he understood the sheer tonnage of my efforts. When he got into a prestigious university, the kind of school I could only have dreamed of, I cashed in the retirement savings I had painstakingly accumulated. It was a terrifying leap of faith. The financial advisor, a man with kind but concerned eyes, gently warned me against it. "Eleanor," he said, his voice soft, "this will leave you with very little for your own future. I remember my reply, spoken with a conviction that now seems impossibly naive. This my future. His success became my success. His beautiful wedding to Amelia, a woman from a family of comfortable wealth, felt like my own achievement. I helped pay for the deposit on their first apartment. I hosted lavish family dinners in the small house I had finally paid off, my one significant asset. I poured my love, my time, my money into his life, believing I was investing in a shared future, a bond that would sustain me in my old age. I imagined my retirement as a time of quiet reward. I pictured Sunday dinners at their large, elegant home, my grandchildren, his children, sprawled on the floor, my presence a cherished, essential part of the tapestry. I envisioned myself as the beloved matriarch, the anchor of the family, the one whose sacrifices had finally blossomed into a garden for all to enjoy. I was a fool, a loving, devoted, spectacular fool. The signs were there, of course. Small weeds of indifference I chose to ignore. The unanswered phone calls. The birthdays remembered with a text message, not a visit. The way Amelia would look at my modest home, her eyes scanning the familiar worn furniture with a faint, almost imperceptible air of condescension. She called my carefully tended garden cluttered. She called my treasured books dusty. But I made excuses. He's busy. He has his own life. I trimmed back my expectations, just as I had trimmed back my own dreams, to make room for them. I did not understand that to them, I was not the gardener. I was merely the soil from which he had sprung. And once a flower is grown, it has no more use for the dirt. The event that finally shattered the carefully constructed glasshouse of my denial was, ironically, a celebration in my honor. My retirement party. After 42 years at the dental clinic, of answering phones and scheduling appointments and calming nervous patients, I was done. David, in a rare burst of what I mistook for filial enthusiasm, insisted on organizing it. "We have to celebrate you, Mom," he'd chirped over the phone. "You deserve it." The words were a balm to my weary soul. I allowed myself to believe them. They decided the party should be at my house. "It's more intimate, more you," Amelia reasoned. In hindsight, I see the cruel practicality of their choice. It was easier for them, less to manage. But at the time, I was touched. I spent a week preparing. I scrubbed floors until my knees ached, polished the silver I only used on special occasions, and spent 2 days cooking. The house swelled with the aromas of my love. Slow-braised beef, rosemary roasted potatoes, and the apple pie that had been his favorite since childhood. I bought a new dress, a simple sheath of deep blue. Standing before the mirror, I saw not a 70-year-old retiree, but a woman on the cusp of her reward. A flicker of hope, bright and dangerous, ignited in my chest. The guests arrived, a mix of my few old friends and a larger, more glittering contingent of David and Amelia's circle. There was an immediate, palpable shift in the atmosphere. Her friends, draped in casual designer wear and smelling of expensive perfume, moved through my small cozy rooms like anthropologists studying a quaint, forgotten tribe. They complimented my home with voices that dripped with veiled pity. "How charming," one woman said, running a manicured finger over a bookshelf filled with my botany texts. "All these old books." David played the role of the gracious host, pouring wine that cost more per bottle than my dress. His laughter a little too loud, his arm perpetually around Amelia's waist. Amelia herself was radiant and brittle. She drifted through the party, a queen in her court, occasionally bestowing a fleeting, distracted smile upon me. I felt a growing sense of dislocation, as if I were a ghost at my own feast. I was introduced not as my mother, the brilliant woman who raised me, but as my mom, Eleanor. She just retired. I was a footnote in my own story. The moment of immolation came during the toasts. After a few of my colleagues shared warm, simple memories, Amelia stood, tapping a fork against her champagne flute. The room fell silent. She looked beautiful, her expensive haircut catching the light. My heart swelled with a foolish, maternal pride. This was it. The acknowledgement. The validation. I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate David's mom, she began, her voice smooth and practiced. She's worked so hard her whole life, and now she finally gets to rest. A polite murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I felt a blush of pleasure creep up my neck. Then she said, "We all wanted to get her something special. Something to mark this new chapter." She motioned to David, who placed a small, elegantly wrapped box on the table in front of me. The guests cooed in anticipation. My hands trembled slightly as I untied the silk ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was a digital photo frame. I stared at it. It was a perfectly nice, expensive-looking gadget. But it was cold. Impersonal. Something an office gives a departing colleague they barely know. "We've preloaded it with photos," Amelia continued, her voice bright and oblivious. "Pictures of us, the grandkids, our trip to Tuscany last year. So you won't feel so alone now that you have all this free time. So you won't feel so alone." The words landed like stones in my gut. The implication was clear. My life was now an empty space that could only be filled by watching a slideshow of the life they were living, a life I had financed, and for which I was now merely a spectator. A lump formed in my throat, thick and suffocating. It was the taste of my own irrelevance. But that was not the final cut. The deepest wound was yet to come. I had prepared a gift for them, too. It felt like the right moment, a symbolic passing of the torch. With my hands that still felt the phantom weight of the digital frame, I reached for a large, flat portfolio I had placed by my chair. "I have something for you too, darlings," I said, my voice a little unsteady. I opened the portfolio. Inside was not a single drawing, but a collection of 20. They were my botanical illustrations, the best I had ever done, rendered in painstaking detail with watercolor and ink. Mosses, ferns, rare orchids I had only ever seen in books. It was the work of the other Eleanor, the young woman who had dreamed of Edinburgh. On the first page, in my neatest script, I had written, "For David and Amelia. So you will always remember the roots of the garden." It was, I thought, a piece of my soul. It was an attempt to show them who I was, who I had been before I became simply Mom. I held it out to them. The room was quiet. Amelia took the portfolio, her brow furrowed in mild confusion. She opened it and flipped through a few pages, her expression unreadable. Then, a small, tight smile touched her lips. She closed it and held it out with 2 fingers, as if it were a strange and slightly distasteful object. She turned to her friends, a gesture that included them in a joke I wasn't privy to. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, her voice laced with a playful, patronizing affection that was more cruel than any shout. "Still with your little drawings. It's quaint." Quaint. Oh. The word hung in the air, sharp and glittering and venomous. It was the same tone she might use for a child's macaroni art. It was a dismissal not just of the gift, but of the life, the passion, the identity it represented. It reduced my entire being, my lost dreams, my secret heart, to a trivial, old-fashioned hobby. David chuckled beside her. "Amelia, be nice," he said, but his eyes were laughing. "We were hoping for something more practical. Maybe you could finally knit us that cashmere throw for the new sofa?" Me too. A wave of laughter, polite but genuine, washed over the room. It was not a roar, but a soft, suffocating tide of amusement at my expense. In that moment, the floor beneath my feet seemed to dissolve. The warm, fragrant air of my home became thin and cold. The faces of the guests blurred, their smiles twisting into grotesque masks. I felt a profound, chilling, physical sensation of shrinking, of becoming smaller and smaller, until I was nothing but a speck of dust in the corner of my own life. I don't remember what I said. I think I smiled. A rictus grin that felt like it was cracking my face. I took the portfolio from her and placed it on the floor beside my chair. The sound of their laughter echoed in my ears, distorted and menacing, like sounds heard from underwater. I was drowning, in my own living room, in a sea of champagne and pity. And my own son, the lifeboat I had spent a lifetime building, was standing right beside the woman holding my head under the water. The front door clicked shut, the finality of the sound echoing in the sudden cavernous silence of my home. The party was over. All that remained was the aftermath, a battlefield of wine-stained napkins, half-eaten slivers of pie on dessert plates, and the lingering spectral scent of Amelia's expensive, cloying perfume, an invasive species in the familiar ecosystem of my house. The laughter, most of all, seemed to have seeped into the very plaster of the walls. I could still hear it, a phantom chorus of soft, polite ridicule, with my son, David, and his wife, Amelia, conducting the symphony of my obsolescence. I stood motionless in the center of the living room, the deep blue of my dress feeling like a bruise against my skin. My gaze fell upon the portfolio of my botanical drawings, which I had retrieved from the floor. I had not placed it back on the chair, but on the bottom shelf of a bookcase, tucked behind a thick volume on soil composition. It felt like hiding a wounded part of myself. The word Amelia had used, quaint, was a shard of glass working its way into my heart. It wasn't an insult born of fiery anger. It was worse. It was the casual, indifferent cruelty of a god swatting a fly. It was a judgment passed on my entire life, my secret, guarded passions, my very soul. And the verdict was trivial, insignificant, a relic. Slowly, as if waking from a long and bewildering dream, I began to clean. My body moved on autopilot, a machine programmed for domesticity over 7 decades. I gathered the delicate, long-stemmed wine glasses, the ones Amelia and David had insisted I buy for such occasions. As the warm, soapy water ran over my hands, each glass I washed became a bead on a rosary of bitter memory. This one, with its faint lipstick print of garnet red, was the down payment on their first condo. I remembered liquidating the modest stock portfolio my own late husband had left me, the only tangible thing I had of him, besides a wedding band and a box of faded photographs. The financial advisor, the same kind man from years later, had gently questioned the decision. "Eleanor, this is for your security." I can still feel the ghost of my own confident smile as I'd replied, "Investing in my son's happiness gives my security." David and Amelia had sent a generic thank you card. This next glass, heavy and solid, was David's final year of business school. The student loans were a mountain, and he'd called me, his voice tight with a panic he tried to disguise as frustration. "I can't focus on my finals, Mom. This debt is suffocating me." That night, I had taken my own mother's jewelry, a string of pearls, a sapphire brooch, 2 simple gold bangles, to a pawn shop in a part of town I'd never visited before. The man behind the grated window had barely looked at me as he weighed the pieces of my heritage. I walked out with a fraction of their worth, but it was enough. The weight of the check in my pocket was nothing compared to the sudden, crushing lightness on my wrist and collar. David had passed his exams with honors. He never asked where the money came from. Plate after plate, I scraped away the remnants of the feast. The rosemary potatoes, their scent now mocking, brought back the memory of 1,000 weeknight dinners I'd cooked for him as a boy, sitting with him as he struggled with algebra, my own fatigue a distant hum beneath the fierce, focused light of my love. The apple pie, his childhood favorite, was a testament to the decades I had spent memorizing the cartography of his small comforts. And for what? For him to stand by, a silent, smiling coward, while his wife dismantled my dignity piece by piece. His silence was not neutrality, it was allegiance. In the face of her cruelty, his inaction was a ringing endorsement. He was holding the hammer while she drove the nail. I scrubbed at a stubborn wine stain on the oak dining table. The circular, repetitive motion of my arm felt like I was trying to erase more than just a stain. I was trying to erase 40 years of self-deception. 40 years of believing that sacrifice was a currency that could purchase love, that my self-immolation would one day be recognized as a sacred fire. But they hadn't seen a sacred fire. They had only seen a utility, a resource to be burned for their own warmth, and now that the fuel was running low, they were looking for the thermostat to turn me off completely. The digital photo frame, their grand gift, sat on the mantelpiece, its screen glowing, with a picture of them on a gondola in Venice. Amelia's head thrown back in laughter, David looking at her with adoration. So you won't feel so alone. A phrase echoed again, no longer a thoughtless sting, but a calculated act of psychological warfare. They weren't offering me a window into their life to include me. They were giving me a screen to remind me of what I was not: young, wealthy, relevant, and part of their exclusive world. It was a mirror showing me not my reflection, but my absence. I dried the last dish and placed it in the cupboard. My hands stopped trembling. A strange, glacial calm began to creep from my fingertips up into my arms, spreading through my chest until it reached my heart, encasing it in a protective layer of ice. The frantic, wounded hurt was crystallizing into something hard, clear, and unbreakable. I looked around the silent, clean kitchen. My kitchen. In my house. And in that moment, in the sterile quiet after the storm, a single, simple thought rose to the surface of my mind, as clear and sharp as the winter sky. It is over. You knew. It wasn't a thought born of anger or desire for revenge. It was simpler than that. It was an acceptance of a truth I had spent my life denying. My son, the world I had revolved around, was a stranger who wore a familiar face. My love for him had been a monologue, and I had mistaken his polite silence for a conversation. The Eleanor who existed for them, the doting, endlessly giving, slightly embarrassing mother, died that night. She bled out on the floor of her own living room, a casualty of the word quaint. And as that Eleanor faded, another one began to stir. The one who understood botany. The one who understood that some plants are parasitic. They vine themselves around a healthy host, drawing nutrients and life, until the host weakens and withers, covered in the deceptive beauty of the parasite's bloom. For 40 years, I had allowed it. I had mistaken the chokehold for an embrace. No more nor. None. That was when I thought of Lily, my granddaughter, David and Amelia's daughter. A miracle of a girl who somehow grew into a wildflower in their meticulously manicured, emotionally sterile lawn. Lily, who was 17. Lily, whose eyes didn't glaze over when I showed her the veins on a fading maple leaf. Lily, who, 2 summers ago, had spent a whole week with me, not out of obligation, but because she'd wanted to. We'd spent hours in the garden, her hands, unlike her mother's, plunged deep into the soil. I had shown her the portfolio of botanical drawings, the very same one that had earned her mother's scorn. I remembered her reaction. She hadn't called them quaint. She had traced the delicate lines of a maidenhair fern with a reverent finger. "Grandma," she had whispered, her voice full of a wonder that felt like a healing balm. "You and these? They're real. They look like they could breathe." She had looked at me then, her young eyes clear and perceptive. "This is who you are, isn't it? Underneath being a grandma. Underneath being a grandma." She saw me. In that moment, a 17-year-old girl had given me the recognition my own son had withheld for a lifetime. And that's when I remembered my secret weapon. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a promise I had made to myself, a contingency plan for a future I had prayed I would never need. 6 months ago, after another in a long series of casually canceled visits and forgotten promises from David and Amelia, a cold premonition had settled in my gut. It was a quiet Tuesday. I didn't make a scene. I didn't complain. I made an appointment. The next day, I sat in the same lawyer's office where, years ago, I had signed papers to release funds for David. This time, the papers were different. I remember the weight of the pen in my hand. It was a quitclaim deed, a legal document that would transfer the ownership of my house. This house, my only real asset, the bedrock of my life, paid for with 42 years of bleached white work at the dental clinic, from my name to another. The lawyer, a cautious man named Mr. Davies, had looked at me over his spectacles. "Eleanor, are you absolutely certain? This is irrevocable. Once you sign this, the house will no longer be yours. You would be transferring it into a trust with your granddaughter, Lily, as the sole beneficiary upon her 18th birthday. Until then, you remain as the trustee, but the ownership is legally transferred. She turns 18 in 4 months, I had said, my voice steady. Is there a way to stipulate that the transfer of control is not automatic on her birthday, but must be triggered by a written instruction from me, the trustee? Mr. Davies had nodded slowly. A specific clause, yes, highly unusual, but legally sound. You would essentially be holding the final activation key. May I ask why? I had looked out his window at the city street below. A failsafe, I'd murmured. To protect the garden from the frost. I signed the papers. My hand did not shake. I had walked out of that office feeling not poorer, but lighter. I had planted a seed in secret, a hardy, resilient perennial that would bloom only when the killing frost finally came. Tonight, listening to the echo of my family's laughter, I felt the air turn cold. The frost was here. The days following the party were cloaked in a new kind of silence. It was not the peaceful quiet of solitude, but the tense, airless silence of a sealed tomb. David and Amelia stayed. Their initial plan to stay for the weekend had stretched, unspoken, into an indefinite occupation. They moved through my house with the languid entitlement of conquering monarchs, their presence a constant, low-grade fever in my own home. I was a ghost in the machine, cooking and cleaning out of a deeply ingrained habit they mistook for continued devotion. We spoke in clipped, functional sentences about groceries and mail. The chasm of the party a silent, unacknowledged continent between us. The final act of degradation came on a Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after the party. I was in the garden, my hands in the soil, the one place I still felt a connection to the real Eleanor. Amelia appeared at the back door, a mug of coffee cradled in her hands. She wore expensive athletic wear, though the only exercise she ever did was jumping to conclusions. Eleanor, she said, her voice dripping with a syrupy condescension she probably thought sounded compassionate. David and I have been talking. I did not turn around. I continued to methodically pull a stubborn thistle from the base of a rose bush. Have you? This house is lovely, really, she continued, ignoring my flat tone. But it's a lot for one person. And we've been thinking about our future. Our investments. David's career is taking off, and we need a proper home office. That little spare room is just impossible. Madame. I finally stood up, wiping my earthy hands on my apron. I looked at her perfectly coiffed hair, and her unlined, dissatisfied face. I said nothing. My yoga instructor is going fully remote, and I need a space with the right energy. A wellness room, you know? She took a delicate sip of her coffee. So we have a solution. It's perfect, really. It helps everyone, don't you? My heart, the one I thought was now encased in impenetrable ice, began a slow, heavy thud. I knew what was coming. We're going to turn your bedroom into the office. It has the best light, and we'll move you downstairs, to the basement. The word hung in the damp morning air between us. Any basement. My basement was not a finished, cozy den. It was a cellar. A place of concrete floors, sweating pipes, and a single, bare light bulb hanging from a cobweb-shrouded cord. It was where the water heater rumbled and spiders built their empires. It was a place for storage, for forgotten things, for foundations. It was not a place for a human being. It was not a place for a mother. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. But her face was serene, pleased with her own magnanimity. She truly believed this was a reasonable, even generous suggestion. It's actually quite spacious down there, she added brightly. We'll put a rug down, maybe a nice screen for privacy. It'll be like your own little apartment. A rage, so pure and cold it felt like swallowing liquid nitrogen, flooded my veins. But my face remained a mask of calm. I had spent a lifetime swallowing my feelings. I was an expert at it. The difference was, this time I was not swallowing them to make them disappear. I was metabolizing them into fuel. And where is David in this perfect solution? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. As if on cue, my son appeared behind her. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a spot on the lawn just to my left, his hands jammed in his pockets, his shoulders hunched. He, the man whose education I had paid for with my mother's pearls, whose fevers I had soothed, whose life I had built, could not even look at me as his wife sentenced me to the cellar. "It makes sense, Mom," he mumbled to the grass. "It's just for a while, until we get settled. It's a better use of the space." A better use of the space. I was no longer a person. I was space. Square footage to be optimized. The ice around my heart did not crack. It thickened. I looked from my son's averted gaze to my daughter-in-law's triumphant smile. I gave a single, slow nod. "All right," I said. Amelia's face flooded with relief, thrilled that she had avoided an unpleasant scene. "Oh, good. I knew you'd understand. David can help you move your things this afternoon." She turned and went back inside, victorious. David lingered for a moment, still refusing to look at me. "Thanks for being so understanding, Mom," he muttered, before scurrying after his wife like a well-trained dog. I stood alone in my garden. I looked at my roses, my hydrangeas, the mosses growing in the cool shade by the fence. This was my world, my creation. And they thought they could just move me to the roots, into the dark, damp earth beneath it all. That afternoon, I did not protest as David, his face a mask of strained efficiency, carried my modest dresser and my bed frame down the rickety wooden stairs into the basement. I watched him set up my life in a corner of the cold, concrete expanse. He unrolled the cheap floral rug Amelia had purchased online. He plugged in a lamp that cast a lonely, yellow circle of light. Each object he moved was an act of betrayal. He was not just moving furniture. He was burying me. When he was done, he stood awkwardly by the stairs. "There," he said. "It's not so bad, is it?" I looked at the exposed pipes overhead, at the damp spot on the far wall, at the single high window that showed only a sliver of mud-caked sky. "It's fine, David," I said, and my voice was so devoid of emotion that it finally made him look at me. He flinched at the emptiness in my eyes. "We'll have you back upstairs in no time," he lied. And then he fled, his footsteps quick on the stairs, eager to escape the cold, uncomfortable truth of what he had done. I was alone. In the basement of the house I had paid for with my life. The air was cold and smelled of mildew and earth. But I did not feel defeated. I did not feel rage. I felt clarity. The absolute, diamond-hard clarity of a woman with nothing left to lose. They had made their move. They had put me in what they believed was my place. A place of irrelevance, of darkness, of foundations meant to be unseen. They had no idea that from the foundation, you control the entire house. I sat on the edge of my bed, the cheap mattress sagging beneath me. I pulled my old mobile phone from my pocket. My fingers were steady. There was no hesitation. I scrolled through my contacts and found the name. Amelia. "Where?" she answered on the second ring. "Grandma, is everything okay?" Her voice was warm, full of a genuine concern that felt like sunlight pouring into the tomb. "Hello, darling," I said, and I was amazed at how calm and steady my own voice was. It was the voice of the woman who had signed the papers in the lawyer's office. It was the voice of a CEO making a final, executive decision. "Everything is perfectly fine. Are you sure? You sound a little different." "I'm just calling to tell you something," I said, looking around the dim concrete room that was to be my new home. "Do you remember the conversation we had with Mr. Davies? About the fail-safe?" There was a pause on the line. I could hear the quick intelligence in her silence. "The activation key," she said softly. "Yes, I remember." "Well," I said, taking a slow, deep breath of the musty air. The frost came. Another silence. Longer this time. I could picture her on the other end, her young face processing the metaphor, understanding all the things I wasn't saying. I heard her take a sharp breath. "Grandma, what did they do?" "They gave me a new room with a view of the foundations," I said, a bitter smile touching my lips for the first time. "It's very grounding. It's time, Lily. It's time to activate the trust." Amelia. Okay, she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice. There was only the fierce, protective love I had so desperately wished for my own son. Okay, Grandma. I'll call Mr. Davies' office first thing in the morning. The instructions are in my name. I'll have the notification letters sent by courier tomorrow. Thank you, my dear, I said. I love you, Grandma, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I love you too, Lily. More than you know, I replied, and ended the call. I placed the phone beside me on the bed. I did not cry. I did not pace. I sat in the center of my new, subterranean world, in the quiet, damp dark. I was a seed, buried in the cold earth. And I waited, with the patient, silent, and absolute certainty of a root system that knows it is about to bring the whole, magnificent, ungrateful garden crashing down. The storm was coming. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of it. I had summoned it myself. I spent the next morning in a state of suspended animation. The basement, which had felt like a tomb the night before, now felt like a cocoon. I was waiting. I tidied my small corner, folded the few clothes I had brought down, and sat on the edge of the bed, reading a worn paperback copy of a book on alpine flowers. The sound of David and Amelia moving about upstairs, the hum of her electric toothbrush, the confident thud of David's footsteps, the murmur of their voices planning their day, was like a broadcast from a different world, a frequency I no longer tuned into. They were ghosts already, haunting a house that was no longer theirs. They just didn't know it yet. The doorbell rang at precisely 10:15 a.m. It wasn't the cheerful chime of a friend or a delivery person. It was a sharp, insistent buzz, a sound of official business. I heard Amelia's brisk footsteps, the click of the front door opening, and a brief, professional murmur of voices. Then, the sound of the door closing again, harder this time. There was a pause, a silence so profound it seemed to pull all the air from the house. Then I heard the sound of tearing paper, a sharp, violent rip. It was followed by a sound I will never forget, a strangled gasp, half disbelief, half fury, that escalated into a shriek. David. The name was not a call. It was an accusation, a detonation. I heard his heavier footsteps hurrying from the kitchen. What is it, honey? What's wrong? Leon. What's wrong? Amelia's voice was a razor blade. This is what's wrong. Get in here and read this. Read what your mother has done to us. I remained seated on my bed, my book open in my lap, my finger marking the page on Gentiana Verna. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm, like a drumbeat accompanying a great unfolding drama. I could picture the scene upstairs with perfect clarity. Amelia, her face a mask of apoplectic rage, thrusting the sheaf of papers at him. David, his face clouding with confusion, taking them. The rustle of the pages as he read. His reaction was different from hers. Not a shriek, but a low, guttural sound of disbelief. No, this can't be right. There's a mistake. This is a mistake. Oh, it's no mistake, David. Amelia's voice was climbing in pitch, teetering on the edge of hysteria. It's a quitclaim deed, signed 6 months ago. The house, War House, was transferred into a trust. And do you know who the beneficiary is? Do you have any idea? Her voice broke on a wave of furious laughter. Lily, your daughter. Our daughter owns the house we are standing in. And your mother is the trustee with sole authority. It's all here, in cold, legal print. We have 30 days to vacate the premises. Yes, 30 days. The phrase, so clinical, so final, seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the air upstairs. Vacate? David's voice was faint, the voice of a man who had just been punched in the stomach. No, she wouldn't. Mom wouldn't do that. Wouldn't she? Amelia hissed. Where do you think she is right now? She's down there in the basement you put her in, laughing at us. The old fool has been playing us this whole time. The thunder of their footsteps on the basement stairs was like an avalanche. The flimsy wooden door, the one that didn't even have a proper lock, was thrown open with such force that it slammed against the concrete wall. They stood there, framed in the doorway, their faces contorted with a mixture of rage and panic. Amelia's was pale and blotchy, her carefully constructed mask of serene superiority shattered into a million pieces. David looked lost. The confident businessman was gone, replaced by a frightened, bewildered boy who had just been told the world was not, in fact, his playground. They expected to find me weeping, or perhaps defiant and angry. They found me sitting calmly on my bed, my book in my lap. I looked up at them, my expression placid, perhaps even a little curious. I did not get up. I did not raise my voice. I held all the power in the room simply by being still. "What is the meaning of this?" David demanded, waving the papers in his hand. His voice was trying for authority, but trembled with panic. "This is insane. You signed my house away?" "Me house, David," I corrected him softly. My voice was even, quiet, but it cut through their fury like a surgeon's scalpel. "The one I paid the mortgage on for 35 years. The one I worked 42 years at a front desk to afford. Young. This is our home," Amelia shrieked, stepping forward. "We live here. We've made plans. The office. The wellness room." "Yes, I remember the plans," I said, my gaze unflinching. "One of them involved me living in here, in the cellar. You can't have it both ways, Amelia. You can't have the house and discard the owner in the same breath. You made it very clear what you think my place is, so I have taken you at your word. My place is with the foundation, and from here I control the house." David's face crumpled. The last vestiges of his anger dissolved into a desperate, pleading panic. This was the reaction I had been expecting. He was never the architect of the cruelty, merely its willing accomplice. Now that the consequences had arrived, his bravado vanished. "Mom, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "You can't do this to us. To your own son. Where will we go? We've invested money here. We just bought the new patio furniture. We have a dinner party planned for next week." The sheer, breathtaking absurdity of his plea, the patio furniture, the dinner party, was almost comical. His world was collapsing, and these were the pillars he was trying to save. He didn't see the moral catastrophe. He only saw the social inconvenience. "Those are not my concerns anymore, David," I said. "You made your choice when you stood by and let your wife sentence me to this room. You made your choice every time you took my money and offered a hollow thank you. You made your choice when you watched her mock the very essence of who I am, and you said nothing." I didn't know what to say," he stammered, a pathetic excuse that withered in the cold air between us. "No," I said, and the ice in my voice made him recoil. "You knew. You just didn't care enough to say it. You valued her approval more than you valued my dignity." Amelia, seeing her husband's pleading was failing, surged forward again. "You vindictive old witch," she spat, her face ugly with hate. "You will regret this. We will get a lawyer. We will fight this." I almost smiled. "Please do," I said calmly. "Mr. Davies, my lawyer, is quite thorough. The documents are ironclad. The house was legally transferred months before you ever concocted your plan to move in and take over. It belongs to a trust for Lily. You have no claim. Not a legal one, not a moral one. You are guests here, and your stay is over." I paused, then delivered the final, crushing blow. "The letters also state that as the trustee, I have decided to change the locks in 48 hours. I would suggest you start packing." The mention of the locks, the stark 2-day deadline, was the final nail. It made it real. It made it immediate. Amelia looked as if I had physically struck her. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a terrifying, wide-eyed understanding of her new reality. They had no money for a new house. Their lifestyle, their status, was built on the foundation of this home, this asset. They had flown too close to the sun on wings of arrogance, and they were only now realizing those wings were made of wax I had provided, and I had just led them into the shade. David just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. He was looking at me, but I don't think he was seeing the 70-year-old woman in the basement. I think, for the first time, he was seeing the full, terrifying scope of the sacrifices I had made, and the monumental debt he had accrued and never once acknowledged. He was seeing the ghost of my mother's pearls, the ghost of my retirement savings, the ghost of 40 years of my life, all standing behind me in the dim light of the cellar. He sank down onto the bottom step of the stairs, put his head in his hands, and made a sound that was half sob, half choked gasp. Amelia stood frozen, her world imploding in silence. Their empire of two, built on my silent surrender, had crumbled to dust in the space of 10 minutes. I picked up my book. I found my page, and I started to read again. I left them there, in the doorway of my tomb, to suffocate on the ashes of their own greed. The collapse was complete. 3 months have passed. It is autumn now, and the air that drifts through the open windows of my house, is crisp and smells of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The silence is different now. It is not the silence of a tomb or a battlefield. It is the peaceful, breathing silence of a sanctuary. David and Amelia are gone. They packed in a flurry of furious, panicked activity. Their departure was not graceful. It was a clumsy, angry exodus, punctuated by slammed doors and a final venomous glare from Amelia as their over-leveraged SUV pulled out of the driveway for the last time. I watched them go from the living room window, feeling not triumph, but a quiet, profound sense of release, like a breath held for 40 years had finally been let out. I have heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that they are renting a small apartment across town, their lifestyle dramatically curtailed. Their dinner parties are, for now, a thing of the past. The day after they left, Lily came over. She walked into the house, put down her school bag, and her first act was to walk down to the basement. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the corner where my bed had been. Then she turned to me, her eyes filled with a fierce, protective light. "Never again, Grandma," she said. "Never again." We spent that weekend airing out the house, cleansing it of the residue of their presence. We opened every window, letting the clean autumn air sweep through the rooms. We burned sage, a ritual Lily suggested, its fragrant smoke clinging to the walls and chasing out the last of the ghosts. The basement was scrubbed, and the cheap, floral rug Amelia had thrown down was rolled up and put out with the trash. The spare room, the one Amelia had coveted for her wellness room, is now my studio. My botanical drawings are no longer hidden in a portfolio on a bottom shelf. They are pinned to a large corkboard on the wall, a vibrant tapestry of my reclaimed soul. The light in this room, as Amelia correctly noted, is perfect. I sit here for hours, with my inks and my watercolors, the scent of damp paper and pigment replacing the ghost of her perfume. I am working on a new series, documenting the resilient mosses and lichens that grow on old stone walls. They are survivors. I understand them. My life has a new rhythm, one that is dictated by my own desires. I wake when I wish, not to the demands of a family, but to the slant of the sun across my bedroom floor. I drink my coffee while it is still hot. I spend hours in my garden, not as a chore, but as a meditation. Lily joins me most afternoons. We don't talk much about her parents. We don't need to. We talk about her plans for college. She wants to study environmental law, and about the proper way to divide dahlia tubers for the winter. Her hands, plunged into the rich soil of the garden I protected for her, are a promise of a healthier future, a different kind of lineage. She sees the garden not as a backdrop for her life, but as a living thing to be nurtured. A legacy. Last week I received a letter. The envelope had David's handwriting on it. My first instinct was to throw it away, unopened. But curiosity, a gentler, more detached form of it now, won out. I opened it with a silver letter opener, one of the few things I had kept polished through the years. The letter was not angry. It was pathetic. It was a rambling, self-pitying account of his struggles, his new, smaller life, his wounded pride. It was filled with phrases like, "After all I've achieved, and how could this happen to me?" At the very end, in a sentence that was almost an afterthought, he wrote, I don't understand why you did it, Mom. I folded the letter and placed it on the small desk in my studio. For a day, I considered a response. I thought of writing him a long, detailed letter, outlining every sacrifice, every slight, every moment of pain. I thought of explaining the difference between love and obligation, between a gift and an investment. But then I realized I owed him no more explanations. My entire life had been an explanation he had refused to read. Instead, I took a small blank card. I went to my desk, picked up a fine-nibbed pen, and drew a single, perfect rendering of a sprig of hornwort, a humble, ancient, and incredibly resilient bryophyte, one of the first plants to ever conquer the land. Underneath it, I wrote a single sentence. G did it so I could finally see myself. Wedorsi. I mailed it to him without a return address. It was the last thing I ever intended to say to him. It was my declaration of independence. This evening, I sit in my living room. A cup of tea steams on the table beside me. The house is quiet. The digital photo frame they gave me is gone. In its place on the mantelpiece stands a single framed botanical illustration of a maidenhair fern. It is the one Lily said looked like it could breathe. For decades, I believed my value was measured by the depth of my sacrifice. I thought that to be a good mother, I had to be a ghost in my own life, an invisible force that existed only to propel others forward. I was wrong. True love is not self-erasure. True strength is not silent endurance. It is the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own worth. It is the courage to prune the branches that block your sun, to tear out the invasive species that choke your roots. I spent a lifetime tending a garden for someone else. But now, in the autumn of my years, I have finally learned to cultivate my own. And for the first time, I am not waiting for someone else to bring me flowers. I am growing my own. And they are magnificent.